Only seconds after Shinzon settled into his command chair, Picard took his own. 2 Romulan warbirds had moved into positions alongside the Enterprise. Worf said, "We are being hailed, sir." Picard sighed. No doubt this was a second round of threats insisting he hand himself over, but he could not give Shinzon life to continue his mad plan. "On screen, Mr. Worf." The image that appeared was that of a handsome, surprisingly young female Romulan. "Captain Picard, I am Commander Denatra of the warbird Valdor. Might we be of assistance?" Picard was momentarily stunned. "Assistance?" "Yes, Captain. The Empire considers this a matter of internal security. We regret you've become involved." For half a heartbeat, Picard could only look at her in amazement. "When this is over, I owe you a drink." The view screen flickered suddenly. On screen, the Valdor bridge rocked. Denatra held fast to her chair. "Romulan ale, Captain. Let's get to work. Valdor out." With renewed hope, Picard turned to Worf. "You heard the lady. Get to work." The Enterprise powered forward into battle. A blinding barrage of white phaser and disruptor fire from the 3 Allied ships illuminated the Scimitar in brief bursts. Its outline flickered in and out of view, a dazzling ghost. Then the Scimitar fired its forward banks. One of the warbirds was fully engulfed in a blazing glow. Then the hull split neatly apart as the ship was riven down the middle, exposing decks and debris. Dozens of bodies hurtled unprotected into space, accompanied by bright red shrapnel that quickly dimmed in the airless void. The Enterprise recoiled as pieces of the destroyed warbird slammed into its hull. Data called out, "Forward shields are down to 10%. Meanwhile, the remaining warbird, Valdor, bore down on the Scimitar and continued to fire her disruptors. Shinzon watched the Valdor approach. The Viceroy turned expectantly to Shinzon, awaiting the order to destroy a second vessel. "Let her pursue. Drop cloak on the aft port quadrant and prepare for full emergency stop." The Viceroy looked over at Shinzon. "She is almost on us." Shinzon heard the hint of anxiety in the Reman's tone. He also sensed the growing restlessness in his bridge crew. The Praetor was continuing to age and knew it was reflected in his physical features. Perhaps even Bakruk was worried that his master was losing his mental capacity as well and was unfit for command. No matter, Shinzon told himself. He would prove himself well enough in the next few seconds. He ignored the nervous glances directed at him. The Valdor flew perilously close to the Scimitar. "Full stop and fire!" Shinzon's officers, finally understanding, obeyed. Shinzon was thrown back against his chair as his ship came to an abrupt halt in space, too fast for the Valdor to respond. She went sailing harmlessly over the Reman vessel. As she streaked past, the Scimitar fired a full volley of photon torpedoes into her belly and aft. Shinzon watched, gloating, as the second warbird careened helplessly into space, then glided powerless and dark to a stop. Denatra and Suran could betray him no longer. The hour had come for Shinzon to take Picard, to use the captain's life to fuel his own. He settled back with an exhausted sigh, thinking only of the blood that would bring him strength. The Enterprise view screen showed a dismaying sight. Commander Denatra, leaning heavily against her communications console, her dark hair tousled, her face smudged with soot. Rivulets of dark emerald blood streaked her brow and one cheek. Behind her lay smoke-enshrouded ruins. The bridge was in darkness except for the faint red glow of emergency lighting. Picard could make out the silhouette of bodies strewn across the deck. Donatra spoke, her voice very faint.
I'm afraid that drink will have to wait, Captain. We're dead in the water.
Understood. Picard was hurled to one side as the Enterprise pitched under a fresh attack. He fought for purchase, head reeling as the deck rolled beneath him. The Enterprise was being torn apart. He managed to catch hold of his console arm to right himself, but the ship was still listing. She had suffered structural damage, Picard knew, even before his inner ears once again oriented him to up and down, front and back. Data reported from his station. We have lost structural integrity on decks 12 through 17, sections 4 through 10. Emergency force fields are holding. Deanna Troi went to Picard and made the offer he could never ask of her.
Captain, I might have a way to find them. The one thing he may have forgotten in the course of battle is me.
Make it so. She moved swiftly to Worf at tactical, her small, pale hand moving the Klingon's large bronze one over the photon torpedo targeting display. Her eyes closed. She mentally summoned up the image of the Viceroy. She calmed and saw the Riemann where he stood, on the bridge beside his aging praetor. The Viceroy sensed her, his revulsion at her touch, his own fear passed through her like a shudder. She grimaced with the agony of it. She heard Shinzon's voice.
What is it?
The Viceroy, no, the Krook. His real name was the Krook. He answered.
She is here.
On the Enterprise bridge, Deanna's body flushed with sudden heat as she continued to move Worf's hand over the targeting display. At the same time, on the Scimitar's bridge, she stood beside the praetor, beside Shinzon. She saw the console display, its glow green on her face. She was in V'Krook's mind. Swiftly, she used his knowledge to read the tactical display, to locate the precise coordinates of the Scimitar. At once, she severed the connection. On the Enterprise bridge, she snapped open her eyes as she pulled Worf's hand to the exact spot. Now! Worf pressed the control, instantly firing a full spread of photon torpedoes. Deanna held her breath. The first torpedo had connected with the Scimitar's shields, illuminating for an instant the outline of the Predator ship. And then more torpedoes hit their marks, until the glowing shields flickered, then faded, revealing the Scimitar, uncloaked at last. Picard rose, swift and straight from his chair. Fire at will. The devastating attack would have destroyed a weaker vessel. Yet the Scimitar sped out of the line of fire and unleashed a deadly volley. On the Scimitar, Shinzon looked about his damaged bridge and for the first time experienced acute desperation. On the deck before him lay a large piece of railing from the upper deck. The attack had turned it into shrapnel. It had hurtled down, barely grazing the top of his head. In his ever-mounting desperation, he spun to face his Viceroy.
Prepare a boarding party. Bring me Picard!
As the Viceroy strode off to fulfill orders, Shinzon addressed his helm and tactical officers.
Get the cloak back and target shield coordinates Beta 3. All disruptors fire!
The Enterprise bridge was shaken by the continuing disruptor fire. Data reported, ever calm in the face of emergency. Captain, we have lost ventral shielding on Deck 29.
Divert power and compensate.
At tactical, Worf straightened at once.
Intruder alert.
The captain did not ask why the intruders had come. He already knew. Riker and Worf headed for the turbolift as the Klingon pressed his comm badge.
Security detail to Deck 29.
The lower decks of the Enterprise were dimly lit to reflect night. As red alarm lights strobed eerily in the corridors, Riker and Worf led a security contingent in search of the intruders. It was obvious to Will that the Remans had come for Picard. As they proceeded cautiously through the corridors, Worf spoke quietly to Riker.
The Romulans fought with honor.
The profundity of the statement did not escape Riker. For Worf to admit that a Romulan was capable of any worthy act marked a true shift in the Klingons' belief system. The Romulans' willingness to sacrifice themselves in order to stop Shinzon had allowed Worf to see that Romulan individuals were responsible for the brutal deaths of his parents at Khitomer. Individuals, and not an entire race. They did, Mr. Worf. And with his reply, Will also took the lesson to heart. The Reman who had attacked Deanna did not represent all Remans. Perhaps others of his race found his actions as despicable as Riker did. At any rate, Will struggled not to judge. Self-defense against those who wished Earth harm was, of course, another matter. A blinding disruptor blast ricocheted off the bulkhead, leaving behind the smell of scorched metal. At the far end of the corridor stood the intruders, perhaps a dozen Remans led by the one Will instantly recognized as the Viceroy. Riker and the other security crew members returned fire until the Remans retreated slightly. Worf led his officers forward as he evaded the Reman blasts skillfully. The Enterprise group was gaining the upper hand easily. Too easily, Riker decided. Perhaps the disruptor fire was actually intended as a distraction. And then he saw it, the Viceroy diving into the nearest Jeffries tube. So that was the plan, to sacrifice the others in a mock battle, while one Reman crawled up to the bridge and the captain. Riker pointed at the disappearing Viceroy. Worf! The Klingon understood instantly. In an amazing acrobatic display, he dove headfirst into the corridor, firing a continuous barrage from his phaser rifle. It provided the necessary cover for Riker to leap into the Jeffries tube, into the darkness, in pursuit of the Viceroy. On his bridge, Picard stared tensely at the view screen as the Scimitar responded to the last attack. The Reman vessel sailed directly at the Enterprise's bow. The brilliant glow of photon torpedoes filled the entire screen like blazing novae. Overhead, the bridge hull was sheared away. The view screen and part of the forward bridge exploded into glittering shards and went flying out into space. In the instant before the emergency force field took hold, a young ensign was wrenched up from the helm, turned onto his side, and hurtled outward into the airless void to his death. With a force field holding, Deanna raced to take the helm. Picard stared through the gaping wound in the bridge hull. Just beyond, the Scimitar was banking for another attack run. Deanna called out, "They're stopping!" Picard watched as the Scimitar slowly turned, then began to advance. Geordi turned to the captain. "What's he doing?" Picard understood the maneuver, for it was one the darkest part of his soul would desire before confronting an enemy in a hopeless situation. "He wants to look me in the eye." Picard stood and gazed beyond the flickering field that protected him and his remaining bridge crew from suffocation and the energy pulses of the basin rift. The Scimitar was prepared for its final run. He knew that Shinzon would now demand that Picard turn himself over if he wanted to save his ship, so he had to think of the opposite of his natural inclination, which was to protect his ship and crew at any cost. Picard sat in his chair and began punching commands into his console. "We've got him. He thinks he knows exactly what I'm going to do." Data reported, "We are being hailed." Picard stayed focused on his work, but spoke to Troy at the helm. "Deanna, stand by. Data, open a channel." Shinzon's disembodied voice, filled with gloating, filtered over the comm.
I hope you're still alive, Jean-Luc.
I am, Shinzon.
Don't you think it's time to surrender? Why should the rest of your crew have to die?
Unmoved, Picard finished his work, then transmitted the codes to Deanna at the helm. She received them and understood them. Shinzon, I don't think I ever told you about my first Academy evaluation. I received very good marks, but I was thought lacking in other areas. In particular, I was thought to be extremely overconfident. Picard gestured swiftly for Data to sever the comlink, then gave his orders. Geordi, put all power to the engines. Take it from life support if you have to. Everything you can give me. Deanna, on my mark. Picard leaned forward and pressed the control that allowed him to be heard by every crew member on the ship.
All hands brace for impact. Engage.
On the Scimitar's bridge, aghast and disbelieving, Shinzon bolted straight up from his chair at the sight of the impossible. The crippled, scorched Enterprise, using surely what was her last surge of power, headed on a direct collision course with the Scimitar. It never occurred to Shinzon that such weak creatures as the other humans aboard the Enterprise might share the same sentiment as his Riemann crew, a willingness to sacrifice themselves for their captain, for the greater good. The Scimitar banked sharply, but not soon enough. The battered Enterprise bridge appeared on the view screen. Through its large gap, Shinzon saw Picard in his chair, and then he went flying out of his own. The blur of metal rained down onto the lower bridge, bodies tumbling down from above, the enraged death screams of warriors. Shinzon collided hard against something and gasped at the sensation of his now brittle ribs cracking. The deck still rocked, but he pushed himself up to his feet. The Scimitar's once elegant bridge was nothing now but a mass of twisted metal and darkened, sputtering consoles. Of the dozen officers who had manned it, only 2 now struggled to rise. Picard would now die, Shinzon swore to himself. Whether he, Shinzon, survived was immaterial. No matter the cost, Picard would now die. As the Enterprise's forward saucer smashed its way into the Scimitar's shuttle bay and through a row of Scorpion flyers, Picard too was hurled from his chair. He fought a deep sense of disappointment. He had hoped to see the Scimitar's engineering decks, had hoped to see her warp core flicker and go dark. He had to do far more than impose structural damage on Shinzon's vessel, or he would be called upon to make the greatest sacrifice of all. Seconds earlier, Worf had been crawling on his belly on Deck 29, firing a constant barrage of rifle blasts as Riker escaped into the Jeffries tube after the Viceroy. At once, his people moved forward, forcing the Remans back, stunning most of them. The last 3 Remans disappeared around a curve in the corridor. Worf and Ensign Mbewa approached cautiously, rifles raised. But even they, with all their speed, were no match for the swiftness of the assault awaiting them. The instant they rounded the corridor, they were met not with disruptor fire, but with 2 of the Remans leaping forward at them, large, ugly daggers raised. Mbewa, young and not so experienced, cried out as the dagger plunged into the juncture of his neck and shoulder. Meanwhile, the Klingon, whose strength was a better match for the Remans, lifted his phaser rifle just in time for his own attacker's dagger to hit his rifle. Using the rifle as a shield, Worf battered the Reman. Then the Klingon turned, remembering the existence of the 3rd Reman an instant too late. The pale, gaunt-looking giant was waiting at the corridor's end, disruptor aimed. While Worf fired his rifle, the Reman's disruptor found its target. Ensign Mbewa cried out in pain. Then his body vaporized, incinerated so completely, not even ash remained. Worf turned to stun the remaining Reman, who, despite his height, fled with impossible swiftness down the corridor and into the nearest doorway, the one leading to the cargo bay. Worf recovered and ran inside and saw that the bay had been converted into a triage area. Dr. Crusher, who was helping to move a patient onto an anti-grav gurney, no longer had enough room in sickbay to handle all the wounded. Before the Reman could move near the patients or the medical personnel, Worf fired at him. But the blast only caught the edge of his hand, knocking his disruptor away. Worf moved forward for better aim, but the Reman was too swift. He seized the nearest medic and took his phaser. Crouching beside a wounded patient for cover, the alien fired the hand phaser. Worf ran around the periphery of the triage area in random fashion, drawing the Reman's fire. The Reman stayed in his protected area among the wounded. In frustration, Worf stopped and cried out,
You fight with no honor.
The temptation for the Reman was too great. He half rose beside the gurney and took deliberate aim. Worf moved, but not fast enough. The killing phaser beam caught his arm, his shoulder, filled his eyes with a burning brilliance that allowed no other sight. Beverly Crusher rose and brought down the Reman with a neatly aimed stun beam. Just as quickly, she ran to where Worf lay, the uniform and top layers of his skin completely burned away from his arm and shoulder. Worf, dear God! The skin could be easily regenerated, but his heart tissue had been severely damaged and he was in the final stages of arrest. Get me a gurney and a regenerative defibrillator, stat! In the darkness, in the labyrinth of the Enterprise's Jeffries tubes, Riker stalked the Viceroy. The access tunnels were draped in shadow. The Viceroy would have perfect sight under such conditions. As he moved stealthily through the tunnels, Riker grew increasingly tense. Only the occasional red flashes of the alarm strobes allowed him to see. In either direction, the tunnels were empty. He stopped, squinting at the darkness ahead, and raised his phaser to eye level. Instinctively, Riker glanced upward just as the Reman let go of the skeletal framework overhead and came flying down at him. As body struck body, Riker dropped to his knees, his phaser knocked away. In the crimson glow of the alarm light, he saw the dully gleaming metal of a Reman dagger, heard it whistle through the air as it came arcing down toward him. He had just enough time to catch the Viceroy's wrist before the two of them slammed violently against the bulkheads. As the Viceroy's knife went rattling across the deck, both men fought for footing. Physically, Will realized there was no way he could win as the Viceroy placed his spindly but crushingly strong claws around his neck. On his ruined bridge, Shinzon stood amidst the smoke and bodies and watched the scene on one of the few working monitors, that of the two ships locked together, the Enterprise's saucer wedged firmly into the Scimitar's flank. Tactical had gone dark, but the helm was working, and one of the two surviving bridge officers hurried to man it.
Divert all power to the engines. Full reverse.
As the Scimitar slowly began to tear herself free, the Enterprise was thrashed from side to side. Deep within the Federation ship's belly, the first jolt threw the Viceroy backward, causing his keen-edged talons to scrape the skin from Riker's neck. Riker saw nearby an access plate loosened by the ship's lurches, outlined in the darkness by the brilliant glow of the power relays hidden beneath it. He leapt for the plate and tore it from the bulkhead, unleashing a brilliant flood of light. The Viceroy grimaced with pain and raised clawed hands to his eyes. Riker dove for him, slammed into him at waist level. They both tumbled down into an apparently depthless vertical access tunnel. Instinctively, Riker grabbed for the rung he knew had to be there and caught hold. A stabbing, almost unbearable pain shot through his lower leg. He looked down. The Reman clung to him, talons digging deep into the leg of Riker's uniform. Riker pushed against the Reman's face and forced his head back so he thought it would snap. At last, the Viceroy's claws began to retract, and with a final effort, Riker seized the hand and pulled at the talons embedded in his leg. The Viceroy, dangling against the black, apparently bottomless drop, stared up at him in surprise. Riker stared down at the Reman with disgust. "Don't worry. Hell is dark." He pushed the white claw away. It flexed once, grasping, then spread out in a gesture of succor and helplessness. Riker watched joylessly as his enemy fell silently, inevitably, to his death. As the scimitar continued to pull herself free, Picard stood, steadying himself on his command chair. He had hoped above all to disable the scimitar, to render her navigation or warp drive powerless. But Shinzon had reacted too quickly. Now, as Shinzon had correctly surmised, he was forced to do the one thing he had wanted to avoid at all costs.
Data, I need you.
Data stepped beside his captain as Picard gave what he thought would be his last command.
Computer, auto-destruct sequence Omega. 0 time delay. Recognize voice pattern Jean-Luc Picard. Authorization Alpha Alpha 305.
He broke off as the computer droned.
Auto-destruct is offline.
The Enterprise gave a final lurch. The scimitar was free. The sudden silence struck Picard as eerie. He watched through the hole in his bridge as the great warbird backed away. As Shinzon stared at the image of the battle-scarred Enterprise, a wave of dizziness and pain overtook him. He knew that death was close. He had heard nothing from the Viceroy, and as much as he trusted the Krook's determination, he felt with a sinking sensation that his friend was forever gone. He could allow Picard no more time, which meant he could allow himself, Shinzon, no more time either. He gave his order to the helm.
Target disruptors. Destroy them.
The Reman officer turned to look at him.
Disruptors are offline, sir.
Shinzon looked up at the image of the Enterprise.
Deploy the weapon. Kill everything on that ship. Then set a course for Earth.
What about Picard?
Our greater goal is more important, brother.
He looked back at the image of the wounded Enterprise.
Some ideals are worth dying for, aren't they, Jean-Luc?
A second Reman went to a working console. As the entire bridge began to thrum with power, blue-green energy beams coursed upward through the arches of the bridge. Gasping with effort, Shinzon forced himself up the staircase to the antechamber above. There, a platform in the deck began to fold open. Shinzon watched, mesmerized, as a double helix energy pulse grew upward, then began to pulse with emerald green light. Perhaps it was fitting, he thought, that the weapon he had planned to use against the universe would now be the cause of his own end. Certainly it was fitting that it be Picard's, and Shinzon wondered what his double thought at this very instant, as the scimitar itself began to unfold its deadly array of panels like a flower in accelerated bloom. On the Enterprise, Picard and his remaining officers watched as panels began to unfold from the flanks of the scimitar. Picard turned to Geordi.
How long until he can fire?
The targeting sequence should take about 4 minutes.
Deanna shook her head, bewildered.
But how can he, Captain? He'll kill you.
Picard answered grimly. This isn't about me anymore. He strode to the weapons locker, took a phaser rifle, and ordered Geordi.
Prepare for a site-to-site transport.
Picard pressed a control on the rifle.
Commander Data, you have the bridge. Use all available power to move away from the scimitar.
He glanced at Geordi.
Now, Mr. LaForge.
As Picard finally dematerialized out of view, the transporter panel suddenly sputtered. Geordi shook his head. That's it. Transporters are down. Then Data spoke with a hint of cheerfulness in his tone. Counselor Troy, please assume command. Geordi, if you will come with me. Soon, on one of the damaged decks, Geordi stood beside Data, staring with him at the end of the corridor where the vastness of space loomed, thinly veiled by a flickering force field. In his hands, Geordi held a tricorder, and with the press of a control, he initiated a separate force field around himself. What is our exact distance, Geordi? Geordi did a quick scan. 437 meters. It was a wild idea that Data had come up with. Geordi wanted to remove the force field, to take Data's arm, persuade him not to go. But it was the only chance to save the captain. Data ran down the long corridor with preternatural speed, and when he was but an arm's length from the opening in the field, Geordi pressed a different control on the tricorder. The field snapped off. The vacuum of space rushed in. The violent decompression gave Data momentum as he dove into the rift. Geordi stayed, watching, a sudden tightness in his throat, a strange emptiness in him, as if his own field had failed and his lungs had been sucked empty by the void. The android floated toward the scimitar. As he sailed past the warbird, he thrust out a hand to catch hold of the ship and failed, just missing a piece of dangling wreckage. Helpless, he floated on into space. Abruptly, he slammed into something completely invisible and most definitely solid, the cloaked aft of the scimitar. Geordi watched as the android pulled himself onto the invisible hull, ripped open a panel, then climbed slowly inside. Shinzon stood in the bridge's antechamber, staring into the Thalaron activation matrix. With some difficulty, he drew himself away. He stopped before the main screen. There was one more thing he needed to see before he died: the destruction of the Enterprise. He was only sorry that he could not see Picard die in person. But the captain would see the green glow first, and unlike those in the Romulan Senate chamber, Picard would be afraid because he would know what followed. The glow would envelop him, caress him, and then his flesh would begin to melt. The pain, Shinzon imagined, would be unspeakable. Shinzon turned and saw the bridge door explode inward, with Picard standing in the twisted frame, phaser rifle ready. Shinzon glanced up swiftly at the Matrix, tensed as if to move toward it. Picard caught his look and gesture and understood at once. The captain lifted the rifle and took aim. But the two Remans at their stations had already spun about. As the beams streaked through the air and struck bulkheads, Picard dove for cover behind the remaining railing. Picard first stunned one Reman, then another with astonishing accuracy. But a final disruptor blast ricocheted off the bulkhead and grazed his shoulder, knocking the captain to the deck and the phaser rifle from his grasp. Utter desperation gave the dying Shinzon a strength he could not possibly have possessed. He sprinted up the stairs toward the antechamber, and Picard at the same time that Picard raced down the stairs for him. Shinzon pulled a jagged-edged dagger from his belt and slashed out at the captain's arms, shoulders, chest. But his jabs met only air as Picard recoiled. He caught Shinzon's wrist, gave a hard snap, and the dagger went flying. But Shinzon kicked out and Picard went tumbling. Shinzon dove into the antechamber, determined to protect it to the end. Nearby lay a fallen disruptor. Shinzon spotted it, ran for it. At the same time, Picard leapt up and caught a piece of wreckage, a long, jagged section of railing shaken loose during battle. He ran forward to face his enemy and thrust it forward like a spear, and caught Shinzon in the instant before he could bend down to retrieve the disruptor. The railing, its edges sharp as any dagger, pierced the younger man just beneath the ribs, just beneath the heart. Shinzon gazed upon the face of his enemy, so like his own, with infinite disbelief. He, Shinzon, could not lose. He could not be defeated, and certainly it was unthinkable that Picard, of all creatures, should be the one to destroy him. In the next instant, Shinzon accepted that the wound was fatal. But his mind willed that his body would not die. He moved forward, toward Picard, forcing the captain back against a bulkhead, forcing his, Shinzon's body, down the length of the makeshift spear. The metal crushed its way through his internal organs, pushed itself against the thick muscles and skin of his back, then thrust itself out the other end, glistening with his blood. In an effort to ignore the pain, he focused on the computer as it began its final countdown.
60, 59.
I'm glad we're together now, Jean-Luc. Our destiny is complete.
With agonizing effort, he thrust himself the entire length of the railing and clasped trembling hands around Picard's throat.
48.
Picard heard the computer countdown with a sense of furious frustration. But Shinzon's grip on Picard's neck was alarmingly strong.
43.
And as the captain struggled, he saw, as if in a dream, Data rush into the antechamber. Without hesitation, Data pulled the emergency transport unit from his wrist and slapped the small silver disc firmly on Picard's shoulder. Picard was too startled to speak, nor did Data say a word. He merely gazed on his captain, and in that instant Picard knew without a doubt that he saw the impossible in eyes supposedly incapable of emotion. Friendship, loyalty, compassion, nobility.
20.
Data activated the device. Data gazed for only an instant at the spot where Picard had stood. He already knew all of the things Picard had not been able to say. He had seen the deep affection and the sorrow in the captain's eyes, and had appreciated both.
15.
Goodbye, Captain.
14.
He knew that the captain and the others would miss him very much. But at the same time, he was extremely pleased to be able to save their lives. He thought of Geordi, and the captain, and Deanna, and Commander Riker, and Dr. Crusher, and Worf, and all the other crew members aboard the Enterprise, and felt a strange sensation that went beyond pleasure at knowing that he would help them continue to live. Perhaps this was happiness. As for his own loss of existence, Data felt no regret. Death held no mystery for him. He had been deactivated before and knew it was simply nothingness. Unlike a living being, he feared no pain. But there was a fresh meaning given his own life now that he had chosen to limit its span, to be mortal. The awareness of impending death gave life a preciousness, a value it might otherwise not have. In his final moment, before he pulled out his phaser and fired point-blank into the Thalaron matrix, Data allowed himself full access to all memories of his friend simultaneously. And in the glorious instant before the matrix itself exploded in an eruption of emerald and ruby fire, incinerating the android into ash,
5.
Data was with all of them.
3. 2. 1.
As Picard materialized onto the Enterprise, he saw through the gaping hole in his bridge A brilliant flash as the scimitar dissolved into whirling bits of shrapnel. He did not permit himself to look away, to close his eyes, or to shield them, but permitted himself to be temporarily blinded. And when the blindness faded, and many of the minute scraps of metal that had been the scimitar had flown away, Picard continued to stare out through the force field and saw nothing but a faintly glowing field of debris against the darkness of space, illumined erratically by the energy bursts of the basin rift. He was aware of Deanna at the helm, spinning toward him to search his face, and of Geordi leaning forward from the upper rear deck, waiting for data to materialize. Grief settled over Picard, so heavy that he could not move, could only continue to stare beyond the force field at what remained of his friend. For a long moment, no one spoke. At last, Geordi announced to the bridge, "Sir, we're being hailed."
Open a channel, Mr. LaForge.
This is Commander Donatra of the Valdor. We're dispatching shuttles with medical personnel and supplies. You've earned a friend in the Romulan Empire today, Captain. I hope the first of many. I honor your loss. Valdor out.
Picard nodded to Riker.
Number 1, you have the bridge.
He turned and headed at once for the sanctuary of his ready room, to grieve in private. When the doors closed over him, Deanna finally allowed herself to cry. In sickbay, Beverly Crusher was standing over Worf's diagnostic bed with a sense of futility. The damaged area of his heart was not recovering the way it should. It beat arrhythmically when it beat at all, and now he was on life support until Crusher could find the time to research the situation and pray necrosis of the tissue did not set in. When she would find that time, she did not know. The number of wounded was staggering, and so many of them were priority cases. Her friend was dying, and she did not know what to do to save him. Behind her, a female voice spoke. "May I do something to help?" Beverly turned. A tall Romulan woman, silver streaks in her dark hair, nodded to her. "I am Dr. Venora from the warbird Valdor. We have come to provide medical assistance." She lifted a brow ever so slightly as she assessed Beverly's expression and the hand the human had laid on Worf's arm. "He is your friend?" Beverly nodded. "His heart is damaged." "And he is experiencing arrhythmia?" Crusher turned to her, suddenly hopeful. In sickbay, Worf woke to find 2 smiling women standing over him. Dr. Crusher, and, much to his discomfort, a Romulan. He tried to climb off the diagnostic bed, but Crusher genially forced him to remain sitting. "Let me tell you, Commander, you gave me a terrible start. In fact, you almost died. And if you ever decide to pull another stunt like the one you pulled, drawing the Reman's fire, very nearly succeeding in sacrificing yourself, if you ever do that again, Worf, I promise I'll shoot you myself." Worf assumed that this was an attempt at Terran humor.
I am feeling well now, Doctor, and will return to my post. Thank you for saving my life.
"I didn't save it, Worf." Crusher gestured at the Romulan woman standing beside her. "Dr. Venora from the Valdor did." Worf stopped and studied the woman standing beside Crusher. She was older, with streaks of iron in her hair. Romulans were long-lived, like the Vulcans, and this woman had probably lived well over a century. She had probably been alive when the Romulans were still out massacring humans, definitely alive when his parents had been killed at Kittimer. For a moment he thought of asking her what she thought of such deeds, whether she had approved of them when they had happened. Then he considered, whatever this doctor had thought, whatever she might have done herself, she was here now, aboard the Enterprise, helping as best she could. She was working to save lives, not take them. Worf looked at Dr. Venora and forced himself not to see the ruins of Kittimer, not to imagine his parents' death cries. Instead, he saw a tall, slender woman with dark hair, a woman who smiled at him.
Thank you. Thank you for saving my life.
Hours later, in the captain's quarters, a quiet group had gathered. Crusher, Worf, and LaForge, now dressed in their regular uniforms. Picard had called them there, and upon their arrival had served each a glass of the precious Chateau Picard wine. They spoke little, but settled comfortably in the cabin, exhausted, Picard knew, by the events that had very nearly taken each of their lives and had claimed the life of their dear friend. Per instructions, Riker and Troy entered without sounding the door chime. Picard was ready for them and handed each a glass of wine. The look Riker gave him, and then Troy, was most difficult for the captain to bear. Riker leaned against the desk, his arm around Deanna. A moment of silence followed. Then Picard regarded them each, one by one, and slowly raised his glass.
To absent friends. To family.
As they had so recently at Will and Deanna's wedding, they lifted their glasses, then drank. Troy leaned against Riker and gazed up at him, and Riker, bless him, understood, and smiled as only he could smile. The first time I met Data, he was standing against a tree in the holodeck, whistling. I thought he was the funniest thing I'd ever seen. No matter what he did, he just couldn't get that damn tune right. LaForge chimed in with sudden enthusiasm. And he couldn't tell a joke to save his life. Do you remember when he created that holodeck program so he could practice stand-up comedy? Picard listened to them all, smiled at them all, as they remembered the happiest times of Data's life, of their own lives where his had touched theirs. And as he did, he promised himself and Data most solemnly to accept Data's sacrifice with joy, not guilt, to let the fact that Data had given his life for Picard's to make Picard's remaining years more precious, more meaningful, knowing they had been bought at such a price. The hardest thing for Geordi LaForge was not the terrible shock of realizing his friend was dead, or of speaking about him during the wake, but in returning to Data's cabin and packing up his belongings. It might have been easier had Geordi gone alone, without Worf, who had insisted on coming. At least then Geordi could allow himself the release of tears without horrifying the Klingon. But Data's presence was everywhere. The Sherlock Holmes deerstalker's hat, the violin, Data's paintings. Geordi glanced up at the sound of something on the dresser being knocked over. Data's orange tabby, Spot, jumped onto a console and looked pointedly up at the two officers. Geordi glanced at Worf, who returned a helpless look. What indeed should be done with the cat? Data would probably want Geordi to care for it, since the engineer was his closest friend. But Spot made his own decision. Without hesitation, the cat leapt into Worf's arms. The startled Klingon held the animal with an uncomfortable expression.
I am not a cat person.
I think you are now, Worf. Worf looked down at the cat, who nestled comfortably into the Klingon's strong arms. As Spot began purring, Geordi grinned at the pair. Within weeks, the Enterprise was in space dock over Earth, enclosed in a great womb of scaffolding whence she would be reborn, ready once more for space. Picard himself was feeling younger, though by rights the battle with Shinzon and grief over Data's death should have aged him. He had promised himself, for the android's sake, to approach life with renewed zeal. He sat in his ready room and smiled at the image of Beverly Crusher on his view screen. She sat in her spanking new office at Starfleet Medical, complaining loudly and clearly enjoying herself immensely.
They're running me ragged, Jean-Luc. Nothing but questions, day and night. I love it. Come to dinner and I'll tell you all about it. There's a Bajoran band at the officers' mess.
I'd love to, Beverly, but I have so much work here. She understood and gave him a small, tender smile.
Soon then. I'll save the last dance for you.
As her image faded and the screen darkened, Picard looked up. Will Riker entered, looking significantly more suntanned than he had a few weeks before. Picard did not need to ask him how he had found things on the Opal Sea. Weeks earlier, before Will and Deanna had departed for their honeymoon, Picard had taken his leave of Counselor Troy. The counselor had appeared in civilian clothing, her long dark hair falling straight upon her shoulders, framing a face that made no effort to hide her emotions. She told Picard, "I'm sensing a great deal of sadness, and it's coming from me. I'll miss you, Captain." She hugged Picard. He returned the gesture wholeheartedly, then pulled back to look at her with a determined smile. "And I'm sensing optimism for the future. We are both going to where we need to be, where we'll be happiest." Deanna forced a smile. "The Opal Sea." "And while you're there, Counselor, do me a favor. Don't think of me. Consider that an order." She had gleefully agreed, and on that note they had parted. Now the time had come for Picard to say farewell to her husband. Riker stood at attention. "Permission to disembark, sir." Picard stood and smiled. "Granted. Where's the Titan off to?" It was Riker's turn to smile. "The neutral zone. We'll be heading up the new task force. Apparently the Romulans are interested in talking." Picard let himself be proud. "I couldn't think of a better man for the job. And when your first officer insists that you can't go away on missions, ignore him." Riker grinned. "I intend to." And then his grin faded and his manner once again became solemn. "Serving with you has been an honor." Picard gazed on him with frank affection and admiration. "The honor was mine, Captain Riker." He offered his hand. Riker gripped it, then turned and was gone. That same night, sleep had eluded Picard. The realization came to him that he had to speak to someone in particular, and unburden his heart about the amazing being that Data had been, about all that Data had meant to him, had taught him. His grief allowed him no option, and so he had gone very late down the darkened corridors and brought that someone back to his quarters. He had sat down at his desk and told the entire story of Data from the first time he met the android until the moment of Data's heroic sacrifice, which saved them all. As Picard at last finished, he added one thing. "I don't know if all this has made sense to you, but I wanted you to know what kind of man he was. In his quest to be more like us, he helped show us what it means to be human." Across from him sat the B-4. He wore Data's features, Data's body, but the blankness of his expression tore at Picard's heart. "My brother was not human." No, he wasn't. But his wonder and his curiosity about every facet of human life helped all of us see the best parts of ourselves. he embraced change because he always wanted to be more than he was. I do not understand. Well, I hope someday you will. Worf's voice interrupted on comm.
Captain, warp engines are ready to go online.
Picard straightened. On my way. Please inform Commander LaForge. He stood, then glanced down at the B-4. We'll talk later. The B-4 failed to respond. He was staring blankly at the bulkhead. Picard squelched a fresh surge of grief at the sight. It was foolish of him to have thought that he could make the B-4 understand what his brother had been. Picard moved from behind the desk and headed to the door. Behind him, the B-4 murmured something. Never saw the sun. Picard turned back at once. He had been mistaken. It had not been blankness in the B-4's eyes as the android stared at the wall. The creature was struggling to remember something important. Never saw the sun. Picard waited, then prompted the B-4. Shining so bright. Shining so bright. Never saw things. Never saw things. Picard prompted the B-4 again. Going so right. Going so right. Picard waited, the skin on his arms pricking. For an instant, he was near weeping. But the B-4 did not speak again. And at last, Picard gathered himself and left.
Star Trek Nemesis was written by J.M. Dillard and read by Boyd Gaines. It was abridged for audio by George Truitt. The recording engineer was Michael Jones. Editing by Common Mode, Paul Fowley, technical director. Post-production and sound design by Gary Fink. Original music was composed by Richard Emmett, Carl Schurtz, Sam McCallie, and Rick Bradley. Blue Skies by Irving Berlin was arranged and performed by David Loud and sung by Boyd Gaines. The associate producer was Sarah Lemanchik. Star Trek Nemesis was produced by Karen Perlman. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio. Also available from Simon & Schuster Audio, Star Trek IX, Insurrection, and Star Trek VIII, First Contact. Star Trek Nemesis is available in book form from Pocket Books.